originally, we'd intended this year's conference to actually devote a substantial number of sessions to Ayn Rand, as it was the Ayn Rand centenary. Now, because of personal factors affecting myself and limited amount of time I could spend on this event, alas, that didn't prove possible. So we were very pleased, actually, at rather a late date, to be able to get William Thomas of the Objectivist Centre, who's in fact been over here this weekend running a current conference next door on objectivism. So we were very, very pleased to sort of take advantage of this opportunity and have William with us today. William is the Director of Programmes at the Objectivist Centre, and as it says in the biographical note, he's the author of Radical for Capitalism and the co-author, I think, with David Kelly? Yes, of The Logical Structure of Objectivism.
But it's just a draft.
It's just a draft at the moment, right. And he's also editor of The Literary Art of Ayn Rand. And William is going to speak to us today on Ayn Rand and the values of liberty. Thank you.
You all have been hearing over this weekend from many people versed in the politics of liberty, many technical experts who have a mass of technical detail at their disposal, and we're going to take a little shift here and turn to some simple questions of value and philosophy that I hope you'll find interesting. This is the centenary of Ayn Rand's birth, and so there's no more appropriate time to talk about her and some of her ideas and the way they relate to the cause of liberty. As you all know, I suppose, libertarianism is a political movement. And as such, its concern is to unite a diverse group of people who share the classical liberal ideas that individuals have the right to live free from the initiation of physical force, that individuals should be secure in their right to buy, sell, and use property, that individuals should not be coerced on the basis of their words or beliefs. And libertarianism doesn't presume any particular basis for the beliefs of its adherents. I mean, after all, you can be a libertarian if you derive the rights of individuals from Scripture. You can be a libertarian if you think there are no moral standards, really, other than the issue of individual rights. You can be a libertarian if what's really motivating you is that you think it's the best system for ensuring economic prosperity. But you could be a libertarian if the thing that was really motivating you at root was that you thought liberty was the best system for ensuring a healthy earth-wide environment. Now, although it's debatable, and I may be biased in my view, I think it's fair to say that probably more than any single person in the 20th century, Ayn Rand sparked the modern libertarian movement. With books such as her novel Atlas Shrugged, her short novel Anthem, and her essay collection Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, Rand inspired two generations of free marketeers with her exalted vision of laissez-faire capitalism. Rand offered a unique perspective. She was Russian, but Lockean, but Aristotelian, but Nietzschean. She was romantic, but she was highly focused on the practical. She was inimitable. Her influence can be seen in the Jerome Bashil's account of the libertarian movement. It usually begins with Ayn Rand, and I suspect for many of you it did begin with Ayn Rand. Her influence can be seen in a poll that was taken in the United States in the 1990s of book club members, asking them, what book had most influenced your life? Number one, the Bible. Number two, a distant second, but number two, a very respectable result, Atlas Shrugged. And here's just a list of a few people that Ayn Rand influenced very heavily who've had a significant impact on the movement for liberty. Reason Foundation founder Bob Poole. Indeed, the fact that the Reason Foundation is called the Reason Foundation is due to Rand's influence. A Cato Institute founder Ed Crane. Competitive Enterprise Institute founder Fred Smith, who keeps a copy of Atlas Shrugged with all his favorite passages carefully marked so that he can quote her. Institute for Justice founder Scott Bullock in the States. And here in Britain, of course, the inimitable and excellent Chris Tame. Bravo, Chris. It's Rand's centenary because Rand was born on February 2nd, 1905, and she passed away in 1982, living in New York City. Now, of course, it's well known, I think, that Rand herself, although a progenitor of the libertarian movement, rejected the label of libertarian, and she refused to be associated with libertarian groups in the United States. She had sharp breaks with libertarian figures such as John Hospers, the philosopher, who was also the first U.S. Libertarian Party presidential candidate. She knew and broke with Murray Rothbard, who went on to be a leading intellectual leader of the libertarian movement. I think Rand's rejection of libertarianism as such was a mistake. She was politically a libertarian. That is, her political beliefs are in essence libertarian political beliefs. And she had much in common with many of the new generation of libertarian activists and leaders, if only through the fact that she had influenced so many of them. And I think it was an unfortunate loss for the libertarian movement, because Rand had a message about the values that liberty requires, and that message needed to be promoted with greater force. This is because without a general basis in values, the libertarian program stands to be continually undercut in the public mind by widespread philosophical and moral viewpoints that are implicitly antithetical to liberty. In the early 1990s, I was really honestly filled with great optimism. I think perhaps it was a consequence of my intellectual maturity, which was sort of blossoming at that time, but I think we can still remember the positive trends that were at work then. The Soviet Union had fallen, and in its place, pro-capitalist reform was sweeping Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and it was having a significant impact in Latin America and Asia as well. In the US, where I live, the Republican Party was growing in power, sounding a significant number of pro-liberty and smaller government themes in the platforms that it was issuing. Even here in Britain, we could see how defeated the left was from the evolution of the old communalist Labour Party to the smart and market-friendly New Labour. The Thatcher years were over, but there was still hope, I think. But what has happened in the last decade has in many respects been disappointing. There are bright spots, especially in Eastern Europe, but there are many places where progress has ground to a halt or been rolled back. The situation is ugly in Latin America since the Argentinian collapse, and market-oriented policies are in public disgrace there. Corruption and religious warfare have plagued parts of Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, places like the Balkans, of course, Chechnya, and then you have your examples like Belarus. Public support for smaller government has plummeted here in Europe more generally, despite the economic problems in which France and Germany remain eternally mired. And back where I live, the Republican ascendancy under George W. Bush has reached unprecedented heights of pork barrel power pole politics, with the debate among the two main parties reduced to an argument over which constituencies will get the most handouts from Washington and who will spend more money faster. The pro-market elements of Bush's program become weaker and weaker, and economic liberty figures in none of the plans embraced by the intellectual leaders of the opposition Democrats. Meanwhile, both parties have come together to render permanent the highly dubious Patriot Act, which essentially enables the US government's executive branch to spy on the nation with little outside restraint and to go nuts in its treatment of foreigners. None of this, I think, bodes well for liberty. But to what do we owe this retreat of pro-market ideas and influence? I mean, is it due to the dot-com bubble and the famous corporate accounting scandals such as Enron and Parmalat and WorldCom? Is it due to the attacks of September 11th and the effects that they had in promoting war expenditures, particularly in the US and the UK, and the effect that George Bush's aggressive policies have had on opinion in Europe? Is it due to the economic panics in Asia in '97 and Argentina in '99? I don't think any of these, separately or taken together, is a sufficient cause for the collapse of support for the market that we've seen. The accounting scandals were bad, it's true, but they were isolated events that took place in industries with many healthy participants. And in fact, they had little long-term impact, outside, I suppose, of certain laws that were passed in the overreaction to the scandals, such as the Sarbanes-Oxley accounting rules in the United States. But I mean, an overall economic impact wasn't that great. The war on terror has certainly increased spending, but it does not explain the rabid animosity for all things Anglo-American that we see in the politics of much of continental Europe. And nor does it explain the rising anti-Americanism we see here in Britain. I mean, the US didn't force war on Britain, right? This was the Blair government that got Britain into this. It's a British issue, right? A little more hatred for Blair might be good, if you're of that view, right? In the US, the war on terror does not explain the Republicans' massive expansion of health care entitlements, nor a vast range of other ill-conceived and irresponsible spending programs. The economic panics of Asia and Argentina were insufficient to explain the change. Those crises arose more from government intervention than from the expansion of freedom in any case. And this was a view shared by a large number of mainstream economists and other analysts outside the hardcore of the libertarian movement. Anti-capitalist and anti-liberty messages were accepted, I think, for other reasons. And it's these other reasons that are the real cause of the rollback in freedom since the mid-1990s. These other reasons are essentially cultural and philosophical. They're moral reasons, and they have epistemological roots, and they pertain to basic and motivational values. And I think the plain fact is that cultures all over the world, and especially in Western culture today, well, that's not fair to say, and also in Western culture today, not especially, but in cultures all over the world, people are to significant degrees committed to value systems that are implicitly and inherently inimical to liberty. Throughout the West, which I'll confine my discussion to because I don't want to roam into Chinese philosophy and its evolution and Hindu philosophy and blah blah and Catholic domination in Latin America, blah. But throughout the West, we see two crucial strands of thought. Actually, let me back up. Everything I'm going to say applies to Latin America, actually. There are two crucial strands of thought in the West that color and inform political dialogue. On the right, we have a value system that owes much, in essentials, to the cultural tradition of Europe before the heyday of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Let me call this, following the analysis of David Kelly, the pre-modern worldview. Now, what are the characteristics of this pre-modern worldview? That, as I say, in essence, was a dominant worldview in Europe before the Enlightenment of the 18th century. But that still remains a leitmotif of particularly right-wing thought throughout the region. But in like Latin America, where Catholicism dominates everything, it has a broader effect. Well, first, on the issue of knowledge and how we get inspiration and identification of what are important values to us, in this tradition, a faith, and particularly strong religious faith, the kind of faith of neoconservatives, committed Catholics, etc., is the most important and most crucial source of knowledge. The President of the United States says that his values are informed by his inspirational contact with the Bible. That's this value being spoken of. When people pound the table at the discussions of the European Convention and demand recognition of a Christian Europe, This is the value that's at stake here. It's an appeal to knowledge from sources beyond this world, often to scripture or other inspirational or religious sources. Secondly, this point of view emphasizes the importance of duty and renunciation. It's a negative view of human nature. It sees people as frail and corruptible, given to greed. Such broken husks, such corrupt vessels require rules, require regulation, require instruction. It emphasizes tradition and authority. We should do things because that's who we are. It's from the blood of our nation. It's the tradition of our people. It's what's been handed down. It's the way we did things 20 years ago. We'll just keep on doing it. That's the saddest aspect of this. And politically, it washes out in a kind of paternalism and pragmatism, and the rise of the new right-wing corporatism. For example, consider the failure of the Republicans to hold to economic freedom as a principle. No, they turned to the mantra of compassionate conservatism, statism, in other words, by a new name. You see, they were driven to it by their values. They didn't have confidence in human beings, and they weren't ultimately going to be swayed by any economic argument or rational argument you could offer. That's not the bottom line for many of these people. I'm not saying they're all totally rabid fanatics, but this is an important influence on their thought. Now consider also the muddled and negative politics of nationalism and pragmatic reaction that we see in the Tories here in Britain. Consider the failure of Angela Merkel and in her attempt to drag Germany towards a real commitment to economic reform. I mean, she's been undercut as much by the Christian Democrats as by the Social Democrats. Back in the late 18th and 19th century, a response was formulated to the Enlightenment doctrines. And this is a set of doctrines I'll call the anti-modern doctrines. And they're very common among the left, the secular left in Europe and the United States. It has its start back with thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Immanuel Kant, who began to challenge the accepted view of the Enlightenment. And today it's the trendiest outlook in humanities departments of American universities, and I dare say it's very widely embraced among the European left in general. Postmodernism, environmentalism, and political correctness are all aspects of the anti-Enlightenment and anti-modern outlook. Its key tenets are, on the issue of knowledge, anti-reason, a skepticism, a feminist logic, a science reduced to storytelling, a deep distrust of facts, a far greater attachment to a compelling storyline. Anti-individualism, analysis and classification of people in terms of their race and their sex and their gender, everything seen through lenses of some collective grouping. Class as well. It favors equality of status among people and is anti-progress. So it features very often calls for more even distribution of wealth, expanded welfare programs to help people be more equal, and tends to be skeptical about new technology, except when it gets very excited about new technologies that don't really make any economic sense. So, you know, the anti-modern left is all gangbusters for, say, wind farms. But at least in the US, wind farms are very close at current oil prices to actually being a working proposition, but they still need tax subsidies in order to work. Solar cars, you know, or let's have hybrid cars. That's a great one. I know it's not washing over real well in Europe, but we're swamped in it in the US. I've done the math. The hybrid cars, even subsidized by the government and subsidized implicitly by the companies that build them, you know, cost 3 times what the gain in gasoline would be at current prices. They're not realistic. But perhaps the left in Europe can continue to help out by putting such taxes on you all that maybe they'll look even better. I think to see this outlook taken to its logical conclusions, consider the anarchist and anti-globalization riots that have accompanied the various political meetings to discuss world trade. Or consider the Luddite terrorism of the so-called Environmental Liberation Front, which goes around bombing and vandalizing housing developments in the name of the environment. But to see it practically at work, see the entrenched forces of the European left with its embracement of open-ended fear-mongering in the form of such things as the precautionary principle. See the eagerness of the left to embrace the Kyoto Protocol, but do nothing real to reduce unemployment. See the calls for tax harmonization throughout the EU. And that's an appeal to equality, right, and anti-capitalism. Because after all, if you don't have tax harmonization, you're going to have that awful thing, tax competition, which actually might increase freedom and allow capitalism to spread, and it wouldn't be equal. Now, the alternative, I think, and the only value set that can actually succeed in supporting a real libertarian position is, in essence, the core values of the Enlightenment. But as we'll see, these values are going to need to be updated for the modern era, precisely because they've been under such continuous attack for 200 years by the pre-modern and anti-modern forces. Now, the Enlightenment essentially of the 18th century was a watershed for science and technology and human freedom. And its basic ideas are still very much alive in the thought of figures such as Locke and Newton, and in the founders of the American Constitution. The values that an Enlightenment or modern outlook embraces include an endorsement of reason and the ability of human beings to know and have objective knowledge, the pursuit of happiness as a goal to be sought, and a positive attitude towards achievement and progress, a hopeful attitude towards the future of humanity, and the acceptance of institutions of freedom and capitalism and viewing them in a positive light. This is the outlook that informed the old Liberal Party, the Liberal Party in England. It's the outlook that informed the founders of the American Constitution, and I'm very thankful that they were informed by that outlook. I would just say that one contrast between the American and French revolutions, which there are many things that are different about them, but one of the significant contrasts was the ascendancy of Rousseau in the French mind by the time that the French came to have their revolution. We were fortunate he wasn't ascendant in the U.S. Now, as I say, these modern values, the Enlightenment values, have been continually under attack. I call them modern values because I think they match most with what's essential to a modern life. Our ability to have massive knowledge of the world through science is premised on a confidence in human reason and the ability of humans to know and to understand and to plan and to develop technologies and to develop appropriate institutions. A society in which people are free to make their own choices is premised on a moral idea that there's something appropriate about the pursuit of happiness. A society that lets companies develop and lets change occur is one that has an admiration for achievement and thinks that progress is a good thing. And after all, the institutions that allow all that to happen are freedom and capitalism. But these ideas have been under attack quite continually. The people who embrace the pre-modern outlook have never been satisfied with the cold, empty, rational outlook of the Enlightenment. The anti-moderns, on the other hand, have been upset with the rigid, scientific, too much fact-based attitude of the modern Enlightenment outlook. And neither side has liked its individualism. Neither side has thought much of the idea of allowing people to simply pursue their happiness by their own lights. Neither of them thinks that progress per se would be a nice thing. Rather, they have other standards they'd like to see implemented in society. And capitalism is not the model of society that they prize most deeply. Now, I think that if we're going to succeed in having a healthy libertarian movement, one that can actually have very substantial effect on the politics of the West, we're going to have a society where elected officials do not continually feel pulled to constrain human freedom because they don't trust human beings to be free, and they don't think it's morally worthy that people be free. And it won't help to have the intelligentsia continually swamped with what's essentially an irrational idealism that lets them hop off racing towards anything that sounds good to themselves and allows them to entrench themselves in an attitude of anti-capitalism and rejection of the industrial world around them. To achieve this, I think, we're just going to have to face the fact that we have to work on the cultural and value front as well as on the economic and political policy front. You cannot sell people a product that they don't really want. You're going to have to help them see why they might want that product. And I think in particular there are just two basic things that are essential to Ayn Rand's own outlook on which I would just urge everyone concerned with liberty to try and work and promote. Two cultural issues. The first of these is the confidence in reason. And I don't mean here logic chopping or Cartesianism. I mean commitments to the ability for human beings to have objective knowledge, scientific truth, and inductive reasoning, reasoning based on facts. This is a crucial value because, let's face it, thinking is hard work, and respecting the facts when the facts are abstract and distant requires effort. This is an effort that the enemies of liberty too easily shirk. It is the effort of seeing beyond the surface of events to root causes, seeing through cherished traditions and beliefs to the truth. It's easy, for example, to appeal for more government spending. I mean, after all, on the face of it, when the government spends money, it's doing something, right? Or the poor Republicans, you know, they feel unable to pass policies of economic liberty in the US because then they wouldn't be doing anything. They would be undoing. They want to do something. The diffuse and poorly recognized costs of government spending after then are not recognized, creating the public choice effect. And it's particularly easy to default in this regard when not a sufficient number of people hold you accountable for your specious or faulty reasoning. When people are much more happy hearing a lousy reasoning in favor of their cherished views than they are actually examining the facts. Defending a rational outlook is going to require defending logic, inductive as well as deductive logic. And it's going to require metaphysical presumptions. At the minimum, the primacy of reality, that what human thought is about, what reasoning is about an external reality that we really can know. This sounds silly, but it's a dubious proposition in many philosophy departments. This has implications for religious faith. It's difficult to say this, but we're looking for a culture where a strong religious commitment is relegated to the corner of life at best. We're looking for the religion of Thomas Aquinas here, not an enthusiastic religion. We're looking for people, despite or whatever their religious commitments, who in practical matters and in real important moral concerns in their real lives put their rational judgment first. We're looking for people who think that this world is the place where value and important choices occur. That's why the idea of a social system that would promote prosperity will actually be attractive, because they want what it would actually provide. A robust defense of this value will undercut right-wing appeals to faith and left-wing skepticism and New Age mysticism. It'll open up society to listening to the true facts about capitalism and technological progress and the value of liberty. A greater confidence in reason would undercut the new Luddism with its appeals to ignorance and uncertainty, and it would inspire greater technological progress. So that's the one thing I think we need to push. We need to push the value of reason, the importance of knowledge about this world, the ability to achieve objective truth. A second important value is the moral value of personal happiness as an ultimate good. This is eudaimonistic ethics, or, as Ayn Rand put it, the ethic of rational selfishness. I think nothing has been more corrosive to the promotion of liberty than the ethics of self-sacrifice. The ethic that says, no, your personal happiness comes second. There's a higher calling that really demands a moral priority. That the noble thing to do is to do something other than make a profit. Do something other than do what makes you happy. Do something other than that which serves your own interests. It's a commonplace of economics that everyone actually acts for their self-interest. If that were actually the case, that people really acted for what was really in their self-interest, we would have never seen the class suicides that we've seen in Europe, where the whole generations of the wealthy have gone off and just to attack the wealthy. We wouldn't see the commitments on both sides of the aisle to higher ideals for government that will call us to service, call us to ask of ourselves what we can do for our country rather than what we would do for ourselves. On the right, the commitment to an idea of sacrifice to a higher ideal than the quotidian concerns of human happiness, human life, and human well-being. On the right, government is then seen as a pastor and a caretaker of society that will inculcate moral improvements and a greater propensity to service. On the left, the admiration for sacrifice and service to others underwrites egalitarianism. It underwrites cries for ever-expanded social welfare programs, and it underwrites the profound mistrust of wealth creation and profits. And I think the historical record shows, from the collapse of classical liberalism in the 19th century in Britain and the US, to the rollback of pro-market forces now, that liberty requires a defense that has philosophical depth and strong commitments to the values that liberty requires. When those things are absent, not only the general public, but the leaders in society feel impelled to do what they think is more honorable, more true, and more idealistic, even when it harms their own long-term welfare, because after all, the whole point is that they're not willing to embrace their own long-term welfare as the real bottom line. Embracing personal well-being as an ultimate moral end implies a moral individualism in morals. It implies the idea that people not only have a political right to pursue happiness, they have a moral right to pursue happiness. That people have a moral importance simply as individuals, regardless of their service to others. I think it requires, and this is the bitter pill here, it requires a rejection of philosophical utilitarianism. It requires that the insight of the economists is applied to the philosophical wing of utilitarianism. This is, the insight of the economists is that there is no such thing as a cardinal utility. That you cannot add up the happiness of all the individuals and then trade among their happiness to find what is really the greatest good for the greatest number. Of course, you can pursue the greatest good for the greatest number, but you have to face the fact that every one of those greatest goods is going to be an essentially incomparable individual happiness. It requires us to say no to extolling service over profit, and no to praising charity over achievement. The day when we see great corporate titans being morally praised for their productive work and their contributions to the United Nations or their contributions to malaria research downplayed, I think will be a happy day. Because as it is, we're in an era when corporate titans clean their souls and remove the onus of poor work that they've done by showing how charitable they've been. I don't mean they shouldn't. I mean, I don't think, great, you're rich, go and change the world, go and try and make a better world, do it. But hey, if you got rich by producing wonderful products that everybody wanted, things that required thought and organization, wow, isn't that great? Why should you hang your head about it? Why should you, well, I got the bucks, it just meant that all of you loved everything I did, but I'm really ashamed of it. I think that's that we can't win in a society where profit is a dirty word. I think another benefit of accepting human individual well-being as an ultimate moral end is that a better understanding of the moral meaning of trade in the market is possible. Because after all, from this perspective, we recognize that that when people trade, a kind of positive sum interaction occurs, where each person is trying to come out of the trade happier than they had come into it. I mean, even in what we normally consider as a zero-sum exchange, we're actually looking at people who prefer the exchange to not exchanging. We're looking at people whose overall sum of well-being has been improved by the exchange. So that every exchange in the free market, where the members taking part have been responsible, and where they both have really benefited, is a wonderful moment of moral meaning from this point of view, where human happiness has been increased, and a kind of blessed event continues to happen all around us. But we can't talk of blessed events in the marketplace if we think what's really blessed lies outside of the concerns of human happiness and human life. And it allows us to defend capitalism as a moral system, as something more than the invisible hand. I mean, the invisible hand is true. But I'm not denigrating Adam Smith here, but there's more to the market than the fact that it serves people's interests. There's this wonderful blessed event taking place. It's something that deserves a moral defense. I need to pause for just a second.
Thank you.
The defense of liberty is going to require philosophical as well as economic arguments. It's going to require appeals to values and to epistemological standards. It'll require a new generation of thinkers and advocates. We're not going to win in the next 5 years. But it's a fight we need to carry on if we want to see the culture move in a direction of a freer and more beneficent society. I think without cultural change in favor of greater respect for reason and reality and thinking, without change in favor of moral respect for the individual and the demands of individual happiness, it's clear that the case for liberty cannot thrive in the public mind. Liberty is a modern political theory, and it requires a fully modern philosophical and moral foundation. And that's the message that Ayn Rand offered for the defense of liberty. Thank you.
I hope you misspoke, Dr. Thomas, when you associated Immanuel Kant.
I'm not a PhD.
Okay, nor am I, and I've been called one, so little bit. When you associated Immanuel Kant with Jean-Jacques Rousseau as anti-modern, it seems to me that an enormous amount of what Kant had to say is wholly consistent with and supportive of the values of modernity. Treat every other person not as a means solely, but as an end in themselves. It completely combines market principles with the highest moral standards. Okay, he did not, like Thomas Aquinas, think that religious faith could be rationally justified. He thought he was putting it in its place and said, there are two things that inspire me with the greatest wonder. The moral law within me, individualism, and the starry heavens above me, the investigation of which by Isaac Newton struck him with the greatest wonder. So, well, let's not go on about the noumenon and the phenomenon, but I think if you give up Kant to the opposition, you're giving up a really major trump card.
I'll only say this about Kant. The opposition took him and ran with him in the 19th century. And it's no news, I think, to the history of philosophy that Kant was seen as someone who offered a radical Copernican revolution that turned the epistemology of the Enlightenment on its head.
Wrongly seen.
But wrongly seen, perhaps to a close reading of Kant, who's one of the most difficult people to read in the world. But he was seen that way, and his influence spread that way. that's the objection. I mean, he was a classical liberal, but I don't think he was really a child of the Enlightenment. I think he was really more someone operating from a different paradigm.
Later on.
Okay, Tom next.
Yes. Tom Burrows. I wanted to just ask you about another aspect of Rand's influence, which is not simply just in the area of abstract philosophy, important though that clearly has been. I want to ask you about what your assessment is in terms of winning our side, advancing its cause. Comes through from what she did in the area of popular culture. She has had, even though people may not always realise, an enormous impact, particularly obviously in North America, popular culture. I mean, you only got to look at movies and even things like science fiction dramas and novels. You can see it coming through at a popular level, like The Incredibles, which I thought was the best one from last year. You've got all of this stuff coming through, which people who watch this and who respond to it may not actually know why it is that they like it, but to use Rand's own expression, sense of life, they know, you know what it is, even if you can't always articulate it. I think that is something where her influence has, in some ways, been as powerful, if not more so, than abstract philosophy. A simple question I'll put to you, you mentioned one word you used a few times was scepticism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are some classical liberals, if I can call it, such as, for example, Hayek, and someone you might think of as his sort of spiritual predecessor, David Hume, who were, in many ways, deeply sceptical people, and scepticism was, for them, a part of the sort of way in which they justified liberty. They would argue that it's precisely because human beings are not omniscient, and that there are many things that we don't know, that actually is why free society works, precisely because you don't have to have known everything. And that's why they, certainly Hayek and certainly Hume, actually saw traditions, moral traditions, as actually far from being just sort of dumb things which are a problem, are in fact in some ways liberating. Now, this may not actually, in that sense, contradict what Rand said, but there does appear to be a contradiction between the sort of Hayekian Humean defence of classical liberalism and this kind of defence. Could you possibly elucidate?
Well, I don't think there's a radical difference between Rand and Hayek on what Rand called reason. I mean, Hayek was concerned that a kind of, if I interpret Hayek correctly here, I'm not a Hayek specialist, but I've read some Hayek, thought about it. As far as I understand Hayek, he was concerned that an overweening confidence in the ability of abstract, rationalistic human thinking, rather divorced from concrete details of empirical life, could somehow order the myriad details of society to perfect and everlasting satisfaction. This was the Cartesianism, Cartesian rationalism, is really what I think he was attacking. And Rand's defense of reason is a defense of a confident empiricism. And in this sense, it's in the tradition of Hume, that is to say, of the British empiricists, but without, what should I say, Hume's skepticism. Hume was a giant in many ways, and a perspicacious philosopher, but Hume's lack of confidence in the reliability of inductive knowledge, and his, in many areas of his thought, his essential plumping down on a leap of faith or a piece of confidence or a moral sentiment or something that just comes upon you, you just do it and don't ask questions, has helped to inculcate a genuinely skeptical attitude towards rational knowledge. The sense that pervades philosophy departments, for instance, that induction is much to be despised in comparison with deduction. This is partly a result of Hume's approach, and I just invite anyone who thinks induction is to be despised to never get on an airplane again. The point is that our scientific knowledge is almost entirely based on inductive inference in its fundamental basis, and it's true. It's true. It's done a whole lot more than practically all the syllogisms that were crunched in the Middle Ages by scholastic philosophers. So I just think Hume had enough sense, to realize that at the end of the day, he was not a skeptic. In the end of the day, he He knew what was good inductive reasoning. He used it. He just couldn't explain it. I think if he'd been like Ayn Rand, you know, Ayn Rand was the kind of philosopher who said, I just won't accept absurdities in philosophy. I don't have to. You know, for the thing I know is that I'm here, I'm real, I've learned things. And therefore, she would say, oh, I go through the day depending on the canons of inductive reasoning. I can't get around and have my dinner without them. Therefore, there must be something right about them, and I've got to figure out what it is. Whereas Hume said, well, I can't deduce that they're true, so therefore, I mean, I'm caricaturing Hume, but I think only slightly. I think I'm getting at the essence of his critique there. And Hume left a tradition with dubious effects in the long term, and in some ways contributed to the growth of the anti-Enlightenment later, and the skepticism that we see there.
Very good.
Okay,
Yes, Paul Marx. Normally I would be critical, at some points in my life highly critical of someone who said the opposition don't believe in reason, they don't believe in objective reality. I would say, well, no, that's impugning their motives, we must reason with them. Unfortunately, for my normal line of argument, I had the misfortune some days ago to listen to a radio program in which a group of philosophers, the radio program's title was In Our Time, which a group of philosophers led by Professor Grayling stated that pragmatism, American pragmatism, Dewey, Peirce and the others, were very useful because we can get away from objective reality and reason where we have difficulties. So if the enemy had not, in my hearing, and I urge you to get a recording of that show if you can, admitted their guilt, I would have argued with you. Unfortunately, as they have admitted their guilt in my hearing, I cannot.
And I do want to say that, of course, you're not going to see, I mean, the power of the Enlightenment confidence in reason is all around us. And therefore, it's at the heart of our whole civilization. And our civilization continues to thrive, you know, it continues, economic growth continues to happen, there is still technical progress, all these things continue to happen, despite the political vicissitudes of our time. So you don't see very many people going out and outright avowing, oh, I have no confidence in objective reality. Well, it's just, you'll see things like, I happened to review the book Collapse by Jared Diamond that was published in the US last year, and I'm sure it's out here too. It's all about how we're running the world into the ground and we're going to destroy it. It's actually a very interesting book. Marshall's lots of information, very interesting. The man doesn't understand economics at all, in the least, nothing about it. And despite his avowals, his explicit avowals that he loves human life, he's actually really is committed to a sort of model of the beauty of intrinsic nature. But that said, the thing that was most disturbing about it was that here's someone who's avowing his rationality, avowing his expertise, but then he'll come to an issue. He's talking about the future of the world, and he comes to the issue of nuclear power. Presumably, we're talking about whether civilization is going to collapse in the next 20 years. We need to know whether nuclear power can help maintain civilization, even after, as he supposes, all the fossil fuels will run out. And we'll just give him his supposition at the moment. As I say, he doesn't understand economics, so he doesn't understand rising resource costs, reallocation, research, all these things. How many sentences does he give to assessing the future of nuclear power in a 600-page book? One. One sentence in which he says, oh, it has more problems than really are necessary. Well, more problems, you know. Tell it to the French, who get 80% of their power from it, you know. Tell it to anyone in the West who hasn't had a serious problem with nuclear power in its whole usage. It's just, that's pathetic. It's pathetic that he could do that. And it says that he thinks his readers aren't really reasoning, that they're willing to just buy his assertions, and he throws a bunch of data at them and tells some fun stories about the Greenlanders and the Easter Islanders, he'll win them over. And that's sad. That's very sad. All his rebuttals to free marketers in that book are, he says he's going to rebut all in one-liners because he thinks the free marketers don't do anything but offer little one-line arguments. So he offers like 2-3 paragraph rebuttals to, you know, figures like Julian Simon. Well, that's a fine way to respond to a heavily researched book full of data about the nature of resource consumption and human life with a few lines. Embarrassing.
Tony Brown, then John Labour.
Can I begin by saying I have loads of sympathy with most of what you said, so...
Thank you, that's very kind.
Just sort of by way of explanation almost, one of the roots of anti-Americanism in parts of Europe is the perception of American society as essentially a religious society in contrast with European secularism. And if I can characterize the consequence, it is America that is economically liberal but not socially liberal, and it is Europe that is socially liberal but not economically liberal. And actually, what a lot of libertarians want is both of those, and etc. Now, that leads on to the next point. It is impossible to have, in a sense, a philosophy of anything, and certainly a political philosophy, without a theory of human nature underpinning it. And the key theory of human nature which underpins all this is actually evolution, evolutionary Darwinism, etc. And it seems to me that there are potentially a key group of allies that libertarians, and you in particular, could look towards, and that is some of the current evolutionary biologists. And the one I want to pick up is Steven Pinker. The Blank Slate is a very important book from the libertarian point of view because it debunks two things, one of which you certainly want to see debunked, because he basically says Rousseau got it completely and utterly wrong. Man in a state of nature is not a noble savage, he's taboo-ridden, superstitious, etc., etc. And then he goes on to say the other myth which needs debunking is the myth that human personality is entirely environmentally malleable, because it's not, most of it's genetic, you can argue about things. And Pinker, in particular, represents a key ally in terms of the underlying modern values which you outline, which I agree with. Comment on evolutionary and social Darwinism in that context.
I'm a little more skeptical than you are that the trends of evolutionary psychology and emphasis of, you might call sociobiological reasoning in the social sciences is actually a terrific friend for liberty. I mean, it's great that people are investigating human nature. I like that. I'm not particularly happy with a debate that involves the alternative, that people are entirely caused by their environments, or people are entirely caused by their genes. I think people make choices. You know, the very reason why they deserve to be regarded as important, you know, as moral loci, is that they make choices. And I'd love the psychologists to discover that. I'm concerned about the way the evolutionary psychologists are chopping up the human mind into a bunch of autonomous instincts and programs, and at the level of, and sometimes at absurd levels, at absurdly detailed levels. I wish I could come up with one address off the top of my head, but there are odd things like strategies for cheating among young friends, and other things. They're supposed to be hardwired into us by our genes and some speculative situation in the early human evolutionary period. It's certainly true that we're evolved beings. A regard for what is human nature, what are the real needs of human beings, what are their real characteristics, has to contribute to the advancement of science. Whether the current state of evolutionary psychology bodes as bright as you think it is, I think is still a matter for some debate, but I'm not closing the door on that either.
John Laylar, then Mark Glendenning, and then that's it.
Ayn Rand certainly made it quite clear that she actually loathed the religious side of conservatism even more than to the leftists. So, like, in her day, she would have hated Bill Buckley a lot more than she would have hated Ted Kennedy, which I find really hard to understand. Now, I know she hated the whole concept of sort of, you know, toing and froing, sort of forming a bit of consensus here. But I find it hard to understand how she could hate religion more than she hates statism. I would consider human sort of evolution to be statism, which is worse than religiosity, which is worse again than individualism. So I know she absolutely hated compromise, but at least what would you say about the fact that religion has good qualities about it, I say this as an atheist myself, but it involves charity, individual responsibility. I know there's a deity involved, and I know there's self-sacrifice, but that's so much less so than statism, which is at the bottom of my sort of three-tier idea here. And yet she seemed to hate religious conservatism so much more. I know they didn't defend rationalism in the 60s and 70s the way they should have, but she seems to be more friendly to the leftists, which are totally submitting herself to the greater good and all that. Whereas religion has a lot of accountability and individualism within it. Not as good as a total individualism, but it's better than statism.
Well, in mentioning Ayn Rand's books, I didn't mention her book, The New Left, The Anti-Industrial Revolution. So I don't think she was particularly easy on the left either. But yes, she certainly reserved a lot of her venom for the American right, who she thought had betrayed the traditions of liberty of the early 20th century in the United States, and then failed to offer a principled defense. She was very disappointed in Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign, which she had favored, but she thought he had completely undercut himself because of his moral commitments and his inability to actually defend what capitalism really stood for. There's no doubt that on the conservative wing, in the United States anyway, free marketism has been part of the tradition that people have embraced. The free market and the support of the free market has a lot of friends in that tradition. But I have to say, and it's certainly true also, that religions, in as much as they're healthy, not atavistic religions, often have many good traits to them. They inculcate moral virtue. They emphasize, for instance, in some traditions, the importance of the individual. I'm not so big on charity as such, but it's not a bad thing. And but look, I just have to say that if people are going every week for their most important moral and life instruction, and being told that the truly important values are beyond this world, in a greater meaning that transcends every government, every human person, every single institution, that has to have an effect over the long term. You can't make it go away. And I think Rand was rabid on this because she thought, and I think correctly, and we see this in the Bush administration, for instance, that all the commitments to liberty among the religious conservatives particularly would get washed away by their stronger commitment to their religion. And we see that in the Bush coalition, where the religious conservatives have formed the hardcore of his support, and they're worsting the economic liberals who have been sent off, squealing into a corner in the current situation. So.
Mark Glenn.
Just on that liberal, one of the things that drives me nuts particularly is in an American context when I hear the word liberal surrendered to the likes of Hillary Clinton and even sort of fairly mainstream, American anti-statists will describe their opponents as liberals. Is there an attempt to reclaim that word by American libertarians and others?
I don't think there's a serious effort out there, although people talk about being classical liberals, market liberals. They do that kind of thing. They don't go out and fight for straight-up liberal too much. I try. When I'm in a context where people understand me, I call my political beliefs liberalism. When I'm among my family, who are all die-hard Democrats, I especially call my beliefs liberalism. And I try to get them to admit that they're all paternalists, which they
liberal is the neocon code word for communism.
Yes. Well, no, liberal is sad. In the U.S., liberal has come to mean being liberal with your money. Liberal.
Somebody else
That's.
If Ayn Rand was up there with conservatives when she was alive, she'd be livid right now.
Yes, she sure would. She sure would. Well, I don't want to run on too long.
At that point, we've got one more session, and we need a few minutes to just break in between. I'd like to thank William for giving us an excellent...